On the 28th of November 1290, a 49-year-old queen took her final breaths in a small manor house at Harby, Nottinghamshire, with her husband of 36 years refusing to leave her bedside. Eleanor of Castile had followed King Edward I across continents and through crusades, had borne him perhaps 16 children, and had survived fevers, childbirths, and the treacherous politics of medieval courts. She would not survive this illness. When her breathing finally stopped, the king who had conquered Wales and would spend the remainder of his reign trying to subjugate Scotland found himself undone by a grief he could not defeat through force of arms. Edward was 51 years old. He had known Eleanor since she was a child bride of 10, married to him in a diplomatic arrangement between England and Castile. Theirs was meant to be a political union. It had become something rarer, a genuine partnership. She had accompanied him on the Ninth Crusade between 1270 and 1273, had administered vast estates with shrewdness that enriched the crown, and had given him the sons who would continue his dynasty. Now she was gone, and the king who built castles to intimidate nations would build something else entirely to honor a single woman. He vowed that England would never forget her. It was a promise he would keep with stone, with marble, and with bronze. The funeral procession that carried Eleanor's body from Lincolnshire to Westminster Abbey took nearly 2 weeks, winding south through the November cold, along roads that were little more than rutted tracks between villages. Each night, the cortege stopped at a different town: Lincoln, Grantham, Stamford, Geddington, Hardingstone, Stony Stratford, Woburn, Dunstable, St Albans, Waltham, Cheapside. At each stopping place, the Queen's body rested while prayers were said and candles burned through the darkness. Edward had seen something similar 19 years earlier. When France's King Louis IX perished during the Eighth Crusade in 1271, his grieving son erected 9 memorial crosses along the route of his father's funeral procession. They called them Montjoie, and they transformed an ordinary journey into a sacred pilgrimage frozen in stone. Edward would do the same for Eleanor, but grander: 12 crosses for 12 stops. The last would stand at a muddy hamlet on the bend of the Thames, a place the Saxons had called Charing 8 centuries before, meaning simply a turn in the road. By the late 13th century, this hamlet had grown into a way station between the political heart of Westminster and the commercial heart of the City of London. Travellers paused here to water horses and settle accounts before the final approach to the abbey or the bridge. The air smelled of wood smoke and the river, of horse dung and the faint salt of the tide. Pilgrims passed through on their way to Canterbury. Merchants haggled over wool prices. Courtiers hurried between palace and parliament. It was a crossroads in the most literal sense, and Edward understood what that meant. For the ordinary travellers who navigated medieval England, distance was not an abstraction measured in numbers, but a lived experience of exhaustion, danger, and expense. There were no standardized roads, no consistent milestones, no agreed-upon way to know how far one had come or how far remained. A journey from the north could take weeks and cost a small fortune in tolls, lodging, and lost time. The wealthy travelled with armed escorts. The poor walked and hoped. Everyone needed landmarks to orient themselves, to measure progress, to know they were on the right path. Edward understood this intimately. He had marched armies across Wales and would soon march them into Scotland. He knew that roads were not merely routes, but lifelines. That a kingdom's power flowed along its arteries of travel, and that monuments placed at crossroads became the fixed points around which a nation oriented itself. The cross he would build for Eleanor at Charing would not merely honour his dead wife, it would anchor the realm. Construction began in 1291 under the direction of Richard of Crundale, the royal mason, with sculptural figures carved by Alexander of Abingdon. The Charing cross was the most elaborate of all 12, costing over £700, when the entire project exceeded £2,000. Built of Purbeck marble with Caen stone sculptures, arranged on an octagonal plan, it rose in stages to display 8 carved figures of the Queen gazing out at the travellers passing below. It was both monument and message. Here stood the edge of the sacred, the threshold between journey and destination. The cross endured for more than 3.5 centuries. It weathered the Black Plague and the Wars of the Roses, the Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries. Travellers continued to pass it, continued to orient themselves by its familiar silhouette against the London sky. By the time the antiquarian John Norden described it in the early 17th century, it was already defaced by age, its sculptures worn by weather and neglect. But it still stood. It still marked the spot where Eleanor's body had rested on its final night before burial. Then came the war that tore England apart. The English Civil War between 1642 and 1651 was not merely a political conflict, but a religious and cultural convulsion. The parliamentarians who opposed King Charles I viewed the ornate monuments of medieval Catholicism as idolatrous remnants of a corrupt past. Crosses were particular targets. On the 6th of May 1647, workers pulled down the Eleanor Cross at Charing and carted away the stone, reportedly using it to pave Whitehall. 3 centuries of grief transformed into cobblestones beneath careless feet. But the story of this place was far from over. 17 years before the cross fell, a French sculptor named Hubert Le Sueur had been commissioned to cast a bronze equestrian statue of King Charles III himself. The patron was Lord High Treasurer Richard Weston, who wanted it for his private garden at Roehampton. Le Sueur completed the casting around 1633, producing the first Renaissance-style equestrian statue ever made in England. Then Weston perished, the commission went unpaid, and the statue languished in storage while civil war engulfed the nation. Charles I was executed at the Banqueting House on Whitehall on the 30th of January 1649. Parliament, eager to erase all symbols of royalist devotion, seized the bronze statue and sold it to a brazier named John Rivet, with explicit orders: melt it down for scrap. What Rivet did instead was extraordinary. He secretly buried the statue in an undisclosed location, then produced broken brass fragments as evidence of compliance. More audaciously still, he began selling brass-handled cutlery to customers on both sides of the conflict, telling each buyer the knives had been fashioned from the destroyed statue. Royalists purchased them as sacred relics of their martyred king. Parliamentarians purchased them as trophies of their triumph over tyranny. Rivet profited from both. It may have been the most successful deception in English history. When Charles II reclaimed the throne in 1660, the statue's survival came to light. The new king purchased it and ordered it erected at Charing, on the exact site where Eleanor's cross had stood. The pedestal was designed, possibly by Christopher Wren, and carved by Joshua Marshall from Portland stone. In 1675, the bronze Charles I rose above the traffic island, positioned deliberately to face south down Whitehall toward the Banqueting House, staring for eternity at the precise spot where his head had been severed from his body 26 years earlier. The statue that should have been melted now marked the place where a cross had been torn down. And this layered spot, accumulating grief upon grief and survival upon survival, would soon become something else entirely, the fixed point from which an entire nation measured its roads. The formalization came gradually. For centuries, distances to London had been measured from at least 7 different points, depending on the direction of travel. John Ogilby's Britannia of 1675 used a conduit head in Cornhill. John Carey's new itinerary of 1798 used the General Post Office. Turnpike milestones measured from Hyde Park Corner, Whitechapel Church, or London Bridge. The system was fragmented, inconsistent, and confusing. By the early 1950s, authorities sought standardization. They chose the statue of Charles I at Charing Cross, not because of geometric logic, but because of historical weight. This was where Eleanor's Cross had stood. This was where medieval travellers had oriented themselves. This was the symbolic heart of the nation's road network, even if the actual hub of the road numbering zones lay a mile east at Bank Junction. Today, a small brass plaque set into the pavement at the base of the statue reads, "City of Westminster." On the site now occupied by the statue of King Charles I stood the original Queen Eleanor's Cross, a replica of which stands in front of Charing Cross Station. Mileages from London are measured from the site of the original cross. Every road sign in Britain that says London, followed by a number, measures the distance to this exact plaque. Edinburgh lies approximately 400 miles away. Manchester is 184 miles. Dover is 76 miles. The system persists despite GPS, despite digital mapping, despite the fact that no logical reason compels its continuation. Convention, once established, proves almost impossible to dislodge. The statue's adventures continued through the centuries. In 1844, someone stole the sword and the badge of the Order of the Garter directly from the bronze figure during Queen Victoria's visit to open the Royal Exchange. During the Second World War, the Ministry of Works evacuated the statue to Mentmore Park in Leighton Buzzard for safekeeping. In 1977, the pedestal received its first cleaning in 300 years. Each January 30th, members of the King's Army march in 17th century dress to lay wreaths commemorating Charles I's execution. Most visitors never see the brass plaque. They walk past it every day, crossing from Trafalgar Square to Whitehall, checking their phones, hailing cabs, hurrying toward appointments. If they notice the statue at all, they assume it is merely decorative, an old bronze horse and rider on a traffic island with no particular significance. Meanwhile, 200 meters to the northeast, an ornate Gothic cross in front of Charing Cross Station attracts far more attention, despite being a Victorian replica built in 1865 for a railway hotel, designed by Edward Middleton Barry and carved by Thomas Earp. Based loosely on surviving drawings, but more influenced by the Oxford Martyrs Memorial than by anything Edward I commissioned. The replica cost £1,800 and stands 70 feet tall. The plaque at the real site is perhaps 18 inches wide. Most people photograph the wrong one. Samuel Johnson captured the significance of this junction in 1775, declaring that he thought the full tide of human existence was at Charing Cross. The homeless poet Francis Thompson, sleeping rough on these streets a century later, wrote that divine grace itself could be found here, the traffic of Jacob's ladder pitched betwixt heaven and Charing Cross. Arthur Conan Doyle wove the location throughout the Sherlock Holmes stories. Dickens set scenes at the Golden Cross Inn before it was demolished. The spot has attracted writers and dreamers precisely because it represents not a destination, but a threshold, the point where all journeys either begin or end. London's black cab drivers still define their professional world by this marker. The legendary knowledge test requires memorizing every street within 6 miles of Charing Cross. The Metropolitan Police Act of 1829 originally defined police jurisdiction by radius from this point. The tradition persists because traditions, once embedded in law and practice and daily life, become infrastructure themselves. Other nations mark their centres with grander gestures. Paris embeds a bronze medallion reading Point Zero des Routes de France in front of Notre Dame. Madrid places a marble plaque at Puerta del Sol. Budapest erects a 10-foot limestone marker. Havana once set a 25-carat diamond into the floor of El Capitolio, though thieves stole it in 1946. Rome's original Miliarium Aureum, the golden milestone, erected by Augustus around 20 BC, gave rise to the proverb that all roads lead there. Britain's contribution to this global tradition is a small brass plate that most people step over without reading. And perhaps that is fitting. The power of this place lies not in its grandeur, but in its accumulation. Grief layered upon grief, survival upon survival, convention upon convention. A medieval king honoured his dead wife. A brazier defied Parliament and buried a bronze statue. A restored monarchy placed that statue where the cross had stood. Officials seeking standardization chose this spot because it already meant something, because generations of travelers had oriented themselves by it, because the weight of history is sometimes heavier than the logic of geometry. 7 centuries after Eleanor of Castile took her final breaths in a Nottinghamshire manor house, the promise her husband made endures in ways he could never have imagined, not as a marble cross displaying her carved likeness. That is long gone, but as a fixed point in the collective consciousness, a place where all distances begin or end, a small brass plaque beneath the hooves of a bronze horse whose rider stares forever at the spot where everything changed. Every road in Britain leads here. Most people never notice.